Good evening. Welcome to the session tonight on doubting science and technology. It's good to see all of you. We are going to have a very exciting and provocative presentation and later discussion. My name is Lee June, and I serve as a faculty member in the Honors College, the Department of Psychology, and also associated with the African American and African Studies program. And I want to greet you also on the behalf of the Dean of the Honors College, Dr. Cynthia Jackson Elmore, who is away but is usually at these particular events. I also would like to introduce Associate Professor John Beck in the back. He will be facilitating the question and answer period in a short after the presentation. And without Ms. Stephanie Sepak in the back, she does all the logistics, so we appreciate the role that she plays. So I want to thank you again for joining us tonight. Some of you are returnees. This also is being sponsored by the MSU Alumni Association, and they are also live streaming it. The Honor College continues to be proud to sponsor Sharper Focus Wider Lens. It gives us a chance to showcase faculty, academic, and other staff here at Michigan State University and the research that's going on. I would also maybe like to say to you, if you have your cell phone, to please put them on silence or vibrate as we go ahead. But what the faculty does and what this allows us to do is to celebrate the work that happens here in a way that lets the local community, students, faculty, and staff exchange ideas about big topics. We never answer all the questions. We actually come up in many of these sessions with more questions, and these great faculty members can go back and do some additional research. But we want to continue the dialogue beyond tonight in terms of the issues that we raise. My role really is just to introduce the presenters and to make sure that everything goes smoothly. And the way that it's going to work is after I introduce them, they will each have 10 minutes. And after that, we'll give them a few minutes if they want to interact with each other, raise questions with each other. I might summarize a few points, but maybe I won't, and if not, but we want to give you plenty of time to engage them in their discussion. So if you have questions, feel free to write them down, keep them in your mind, and then we'll have a chance for you to engage the panel. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will be presenting. First, we have Dr. Georgina Montgomery. She is an associate professor in the Lyman Briggs College in the Department of History. Her research focuses on the history of field science, particularly the development of field methods and sites within primatology and animal behavior studies. Dr. Montgomery teaches a range of courses on the history of field science, gender and science, and the history of primatology and animal behavioral studies. Her publications include the book Primates in the Real World, Escaping Primates Fort Lower, Creating Primate Science, and various articles such as one in the Journal for the History of Biology and Endeavor, book, chapters in various books, and she's also done a chapter on teaching the animal and a chapter on Darwin and gender, a very interesting article if you haven't read it. She earned her doctorate from the University of Minnesota. And then following her will be Dr. Kevin Elliott. He's an associate professor in Lyman Briggs College, the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, and the Department of Philosophy. So you can see he spanned several disciplinary areas. His research lies at the intersection of the philosophy of science and practical ethics. His books include Is a Little Pollution Good for You? Incorporating Societal Values in Environmental Research, Current Controversies in Values in Science, Exploring Inductive Risk, and A Tapestry of Values, An Introduction to Values in Science. He earned his doctorate from the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Rich Walsh is an associate professor in the Department of Media and Information. His works involve understanding how people think about their interaction with computers and their interaction with other people through computers. His research has a particular focus on security and collaborative systems, a very important issue in our society today. He's currently the primary investigator on 3 National Science Foundation grants, including a National Science Foundation Early Faculty Career Award. And he earned his doctorate, and we will hold this against him because of what happened Saturday. His doctorate is from where? The University of Michigan. No, we won't hold that against him. And finally, last but not least, Dr. Erin McCright, did I say that correct? McCright, is the chairperson and professor in the Department of Sociology. Employing a range of methods and analytical techniques, he explains the structure, strategy, tactics, and impact of the US-based climate change denial counter-movement, analyzing theoretical relevant patterns and trends in citizen climate change views, and investigating key predictors of public views of science and scientists. He is the author of The Risk Society Revisited, Social Theory and Governance, and Community and Ecology, Dynamics of Place, Sustainability, and Politics. He earned his doctorate from Washington State University. 4 exciting panelists, and with that, I will turn it over to our first presenter, Dr. Montgomery.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank the Honors College and John Beck for this wonderful invitation. The talk I'm going to give today is an 8-minute condensed version of an essay I wrote for an edited volume by Michael Roos that actually I brought a copy just to display on the table over there if you want to look at it later with the full citations and more information from the talk I'm going to give today. So today, the scientific and cultural clout of Charles Darwin's name, which I beamed up on the screen there, and his works continue to be interpreted and utilized in a myriad of ways to promote diverse political viewpoints. Issues of gender and evolution continue to be discussed in the field of modern evolutionary biology, and also in the pages of popular scientific books, magazines, on the stages of comedy clubs, and on the small and large screen. In fact, if you teach gender and evolution like I do, you even have an article in Playboy magazine for the 1970s, and not many professors can say that. So Darwin and gender truly is everywhere. In terms of how Darwin is presented, it's often in these kind of ways. He's alone, he seems to be eternally elderly, with a beard, and sometimes there's a little bit of humor, a little bit of criticism, like this well-known cartoon here where you have Darwin's face on a chimpanzee. Always, however, he is displayed as the lone genius. He's never seen in a team, doesn't seem to have other scientists around him, often doesn't even need props because he has so much scientific authority. He doesn't need props in early photography to demonstrate his scientific authority. And of course, Charles Darwin is probably best known for his 1859 publication, The Origin of Species, where he set forth the theory of evolution by natural selection. And keep in mind that there were theories of evolution before Darwin, so we need to distinguish that it's evolution by natural selection. Perhaps less known are Darwin's later works, slightly later, Darwin's Descent of Man in 1871, and his Expressions of Emotions just 1 year later in 1872. Together, these 3 works can be seen as a trilogy or one long argument. I'll pause here to note that even if well-known, texts like The Origin are not necessarily well-read. Indeed, most of the students I teach have never read The Origin, so we start off by even looking at the contents page is new terrain, despite the fact that it's clearly a household name. These texts were published during a time period characterized by a debate called the woman question, or more accurately, questions. What were the moral, intellectual, physical capabilities and limitations of women in the 19th century? What roles should be afforded to women in Anglo-American society? From which arenas should they be excluded? Where should they be included? And this political climate certainly shaped the contents of Charles Darwin's Descent of Man in 1871, while also being significantly impacted by it. Anti-feminists and feminists alike saw the opportunity to use the power of scientific authority, and specifically the power of Darwin's name and his theory of sexual selection, to promote what were often diverse views of women's place in nature and society. So what does the Descent argue? Well, one of the theories it sets forth is the theory of sexual selection, male-male competition, and female choice in non-human animals. You would assume this mechanism would function in human evolution, as it did, according to Darwin, in non-human evolution. After all, Darwin quite famously stated that between human and non-human animals, there is a difference of degree, not kind. Right? So there's a lot of similarity between humans and other animals. However, in the Descent of Man, female choice and any degree of agency that went with it failed to transfer in Darwin's argument to human evolution. Thus, according to Darwin, in modern civilized society, the male had become the chooser of his mate. Despite Darwin being commonly understood as a great revolutionary, the human male and female he described in Descent fulfilled rather than challenged the gender identities and ideals of Victorian culture. Darwin saw man as, to quote from Descent here, the rival of other men. He delights in competition, and this leads to ambition, which passes easily into selfishness. Despite man's failure to be highly cooperative and altruistic, or rather because of these traits, he had achieved what Darwin described as a higher eminence in all areas when compared to the achievements of women. In Darwin's view, the result of this apparent superiority were plain to see. And this is probably the most famous quote in terms of gender and evolution from Darwin's work from Descent. If two lists were made of the most eminent men and women in poetry, painting, sculpture, music, history, science, philosophy, the list would not bear comparison. We may also infer that if men are capable of a decided preeminence over women in many subjects, the average mental power in man must be above that of woman. Okay, so he's saying that far more men have achieved in all of these areas than women, and therefore men are mentally superior to women. And he's seeing this as a natural biological phenomenon, not something that's impacted by cultural circumstances. Certainly, Darwin's words reflect an incredibly limited view of womanhood, and manhood for that matter, and one that fully conformed to his cultural context. Now, here as a historian, my methodological approach must include what's called historical empathy. I must situate Darwin and his views in his time period. For this reason, I will not label Darwin sexist. Instead, his views reflect the context of his times. Furthermore, for scholars such as Evelyn Richards, Darwin's conception of men and women were founded on his rigorous application of naturalistic observation, rather than sexism per se. This is a quote from Richards. It's not only historically inaccurate to impute an anti-feminist motive on Darwin, but unnecessary. His conclusions on the biological and social evolution of women were as much constrained by his commitment to a naturalistic or scientific explanation of human mental and moral characteristics as they were by his socially derived assumptions of the innate inferiority and domesticity of women. In recent years, Darwin scholars have increasingly turned their attention to Darwin's view of women, as well as his relationship with women, including family members, amateur scientists with whom Darwin corresponded. For example, the work of a scholar called Joy Harvey and the Darwin and Gender section of the Darwin Correspondence Project, a huge, wonderful online database with Cambridge University, where you can read all the letters Darwin received and wrote, has revealed that Darwin had 115 female correspondents. Some of these women were family members or part of his social circle. Others were not known to him until they wrote. In short, he was not the lone genius he was and still is often portrayed to be. In addition to women collaborators, Darwin attracted women who simultaneously critiqued his conclusions while seeing opportunity in his data and theories for promoting gender equity. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, seen here, is one of those 19th century feminists who used the power of scientific theory and terminology to speak out in defense of not simply female equality, but what she believed was superiority, especially in regards to cooperation and altruism. In Gilman's books, some of you may have heard of The Yellow Wallpaper. Thank you. She weaved together her own interpretation of Darwinian evolution and socialism to paint a vision of a world in which women were freed from society's shackles in order to fulfill their evolutionary potential. In this case, we see belief in scientific authority, seeing opportunity in science, while simultaneously doubting and not trusting aspects of it, often because of being limited or restricted in terms of their ability to participate in scientific work. And this is a quote here, "It does not do to trust people too much," is from The Yellow Wallpaper. Interestingly, another example of a 19th century feminist who engaged in evolutionary discourse comes from here, the state of Michigan, Eli Zabar Gamble, a Michigan woman who pursued a career as a teacher. She contributed to 19th century women's movements in varied ways, including presenting and writing about the women's suffrage movement and critiquing Darwin's Descent of Man. She wrote a book available in special collections at the library here in 1894 called The Evolution of Woman, an inquiry into the dogma of her inferiority to man, which is a thorough analysis of Darwin's failure to see female choice, which was so evident in the animal kingdom, in human society. With elegant and compelling prose, Gamble argued that Darwin's failure to follow through with his analogy between humans and other animals, a foundational part of his evolutionary argument in The Origin and Expressions of Emotions, was a significant flaw in his analysis of human gender and sexuality. Here we see an exhibit which was created as a partnership between Briggs and the MSU Museum, showcasing the work of a former undergraduate of mine called Daniela Beck. Beck's researched a biography of Gamble using archive materials in Lansing and Ann Arbor to form the best published biography of Gamble out there. I've had professional scholars come to me at conferences and tell me, Daniela Beck, that's the article to read about Gamble. And yet this work doesn't make its way into mainstream histories of evolution. And I'm going to end now, because I've done my 10 minutes, with 4 questions for you to keep in mind, and I suspect these questions will resonate with the other speakers as well. Why did topics of concerning gender and evolution not start to be part of scholarly discourse until the 1970s? Why did different people see different opportunities in the scientific work of Charles Darwin in the 19th century? How does the work of Charles Darwin and the authority of his name and image continue to be used today? And perhaps most importantly for the young scholars in this room today, what can we learn from this historical story in terms of the importance of discussions of diversity and inclusion in STEM today? Thank you very much.
Right. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit from Dr. Montgomery's historical perspective to looking a little bit more at the contemporary situation. And I want to give you my sort of 3 take-home messages right off the bat. So first, I want to suggest, and this really resonates nicely with Dr. Montgomery's talk because she pointed out cases where it can be fruitful to be questioning science. I want to look a little bit more at cases where it could be problematic or can raise challenges for society. So I first want to acknowledge that there are cases where doubting science can have harmful consequences. But then my second key point is that there's this temptation to figure, well, if there's a problem with doubting science, we ought to give people scientific facts and get them to trust and believe the science. And I want to suggest that that tends to be a limited solution. And as I lay this out, I want to acknowledge that the real social scientists are down the table here. So the philosopher can go ahead and throw these things out, and then they can say what I say is wrong and what's right. So, and then my third point is that I think we need more creative responses to doubt. If just sort of harping on scientific facts, hitting people over the head with facts is not the best solution. And so I'd like to invite you to think with us during the discussion, what might be more fruitful approaches. So my first point, I'll be very quick about this, is just we all know about cases where doubting science can have problematic effects on society. If we think just throughout the 20th century, the ways in which doubt contributed to delayed regulation of tobacco and secondhand smoke. We've been thinking a lot in Michigan about the use of lead. And so promoting doubt about the science surrounding lead resulted in a lot of problems, obviously using lead piping longer than it should have been, lead paint longer, leaded gasoline and so on. We know about problems with climate change, issues related to vaccines, problematic responses to AIDS. I'm not positive about the statistic, but one of the books that I have read suggested that because of denial of scientific information about AIDS in South Africa in the early part of the 21st century, possibly several 100,000 people may have died who wouldn't have had to, and issues related to genetic engineering and so on. So there are lots of cases that we could look at. So my second point, though, is that just telling people, look, you've got the facts wrong, let us give you more correct scientific information is a really limited solution. And I think that's the case for two reasons. And probably more, but first, and this is more my philosophical cup of tea, I think it tends to promote misleading perceptions about how science works, making it seem like science is very straightforward and we just need to give people the facts and they are correct for all time. But then secondly, I don't think it's very effective. And so again, here I'll throw out some thoughts, and like I said, the social scientists can give us more empirical information about this. So let me just discuss these points in more detail. My worry that just telling people, look, you've got to get the facts right, promotes misleading perceptions about science. Science is always tentative and it changes over time. And actually, we often think now, because there's so much discussion about the consensus around climate change, it can give people the impression that there's always a consensus around science. And actually, it's somewhat rare, and usually it's only very simple, basic claims like that humans are contributing to climate change, where you could actually get something like a consensus. And then often when we're talking about doubting science, we're thinking about policy relevant areas of science. And so there we're especially often pushing the limits of science. And so it's even less likely that the science will be straightforward in a lot of cases. Again, there are a tremendous range of cases, so one has to consider the differences between different contexts. But in a lot of areas, like my specialty is environmental pollution, and there often the regulators and policymakers are trying to make decisions. And the scientists would be inclined to say, well, if you come back in 30 or 40 years, maybe we can get this figured out for you and really feel confident. But the policymakers want to make decisions now. And so in most cases, there's going to be reasonable disagreement when it comes to policymaking in science. And so stifling dissent, I think, can be harmful to science and can prevent us from gaining insights. And we saw from Dr. Montgomery's talk that often important dissenters can challenge really problematic issues in science. So I also would suggest that just harping on scientific facts and saying, look, you got to get your science straight here, may not be that effective. And I'd suggest that in a lot of the prominent cases we look at, the doubting of the science may just be more of an excuse for being able to do things or hold beliefs that one wanted to believe. And it's not really doubting the science itself that would be driving the concerns. So if we think about issues like climate change, it seems like, and again, Professor McCright can set us straight on this, but it seems like it's more a matter of fear of regulation and big government that's really driving the issue. And that if you could address that, there probably wouldn't be as much concern about the science of climate change. If one thinks about evolutionary theory, again, I think that what's often really driving the issue is concern about challenging religious beliefs. And if that wasn't such a concern, people probably wouldn't have so much concern about evolutionary theory. Again, genetic modification or genetic engineering, not to say that everybody falls in this category, but a number, the opposition may come from concerns about the way our agribusiness operates and the way our industrial food system operates, and that may be driving a lot of the concerns. And I gave the example of South Africa. A lot of the concern there about the science related to AIDS may relate to concerns about Western colonialism and imposition of a variety of aspects of our culture upon them. And so thus their concerns about the science. So my final point, and this is where I want to just throw out some ideas and invite your thoughts. I'd love to have more discussion about that. You might say, well, if you're telling us not to harp on the scientific facts, how should we address these controversies if they can have important social consequences? And so I have two general suggestions. So first, I was just pointing out that it seems like there are often these deeper issues at play. I think we need to explore ways to relieve those deeper issues. And so I can offer a few examples here. My second suggestion is that maybe we need to find creative ways, again, I'm thinking especially about policymaking, to fight less about the facts and to sort of find creative ways to address the issues in alternative ways. So let me give some examples. So with climate change, I know you're going to say this is easier said than done, but if we could make clean energy easy, I think we would find that people would be fine. I'm happy to obtain my energy in cleaner ways. And if that was easy to do, then I think a lot of the stress about the science of climate change would kind of fade into the background. If you think about an issue like evolutionary theory, I think it would be much more effective if one's interacting with somebody with skepticism about that because of religious concerns, rather than telling them, look, I'm going to show you why evolutionary theory is correct. If you can show ways in which that religious tradition can accommodate evolutionary theory, I think you're likely to have much more success. And again, this is the philosopher speculating. We'll see what the social scientists have to say. I could say more about genetic engineering. We'll see if I have time here when I get my 2-minute warning. But I'd like to also talk about creative ways to fight less about the facts. So this is an example that actually comes from a colleague of ours, Mark Largent, who's done a lot of looking at vaccines. And he points out that in the state of Michigan, we really were able to increase vaccination rates just by changing our waiver policies, not just sort of forcing people with the science or even just absolutely requiring people to get vaccinated, but making it more complicated, requiring that people meet, say, with somebody from the public health department before they could get their waiver signed. So it's just a creative way of addressing the issue, just making it a little bit more complicated to avoid getting vaccinated could probably be much more effective than trying to actually convince people with a bunch of facts. In the areas that I work in more, environmental pollution, there can be endless debates about the details of whether a particular chemical ought to be regulated or banned. And so there have been some great examples of legislation, rather than trying to actually establish that a chemical is definitely harmful enough to be banned, just taking a list of chemicals that were worrisome and saying if industry is going to use those chemicals, they need to just report how much they're using and also report on any alternatives that might be available. And just requiring the companies to do that, actually they had some significant success in the companies sort of feeling a little sheepish about using so many worrisome chemicals and finding out, oh, there are some decent alternatives. And thus they were willing to shift rather than fighting endlessly over the details of the science. And I would just point out my third point. Sometimes people may wonder, why do we have so much trouble addressing climate change as opposed to, say, addressing the ozone hole? And I think part of that, my understanding, is that there were alternatives available that the companies could shift to. And so again, finding creative alternatives can enable us to get out of some of these conflicts where we might just otherwise endlessly debating the science if there aren't such good alternatives available. So maybe I'll stop there and we can talk further in the discussion, but I'd love it if you all had further ideas along these lines of coming up with creative solutions.
So I really like the idea that Dr. Elliott was just talking about not debating the facts, because I work in technology and the facts are constantly changing in technology. And that's one of the things I want to talk about tonight, is the way algorithms have been becoming more and more common in society. I mean, right now, if you just look around, we have algorithms that drive cars, that determine what classes you take. In some cases, determine grades of classes. Algorithms are becoming increasingly common in society. And one of the things that's been really interesting in the last 2 years or so is that there's becoming additional skepticism about whether these algorithms that are being produced are trustworthy. As part of an initiative from the National Science Foundation, I recently convened a workshop where we tried to figure out what are some of the major challenges and opportunities for making algorithms more trustworthy, and why is this actually a really difficult and hard problem. And I want to talk about some of the things that we uncovered during that work that illustrate how algorithms, what makes algorithms so hard to be trustworthy and why it's so difficult in society. So I want to start by, there's been a lot of news talking about different trustworthy problems with algorithms. This is a news story about how Uber is having this problem where all of the drivers will sign off of Uber at the same time. Uber will then think that there's not enough drivers and will raise the prices. And then all of the drivers will sign back on, and everyone is paying higher prices for their cars now. Another issue is YouTube has an algorithm that is trying to identify which videos are safe for children and which ones are not. And there's actually become a kind of cottage industry of creating what people are calling creepy kid videos that are not actually safe for children, but pass through YouTube's algorithms. And everyone's familiar with the recent challenges that Facebook has had related to the election and how many actors, but Russia in particular, have been able to manipulate Facebook's algorithms to try to influence what people know and think and talk about. So I want to spend some time talking about 3 or 4 specific examples of algorithms that have had challenges in the past and use those to illustrate some of the big challenges that make making algorithms trustworthy really difficult. So I'll start with a colleague of mine, Eric Meyer at Case Western. He went through something that no one really should have to go through. His 5-year-old daughter died of cancer. She spent months going through treatments, and she ended up dying in June of 2014. And it was very sad. It was a very difficult time for Eric. He spent a lot of time taking care of her and dealing with all of the doctors and all of the grief and all of the challenges that come with losing a child. 6 months later, in December, he's using Facebook, and Facebook presents this to him. It is their year in review, and it says, "Eric, here's what your year looked like." And it showed him a picture of his now deceased 5-year-old daughter surrounded by people with party balloons. This was a really challenging, he broke down crying when he saw this using Facebook. It brought back a lot of grief, a lot of memories, a lot of challenges. Facebook didn't know how to deal with this. This was really challenging. This picture that they picked was his most commented and liked photo from the year when his daughter died. And so they didn't have a way of telling likes that were happy from likes that should not really be brought up again. This personal, social, and cultural context is completely absent from the algorithms that they used. They just looked at likes and comments and shares to try to figure out what was the most engaged content. This is one of the biggest challenges with algorithms, is they require large amounts of data, but most of the data is very similar. It's likes and comments type of thing. It's very similar to each other, and it's very difficult to take into account the full complexity of personal situations and social contexts, and to include enough data that you can take those into account. Facebook is still struggling with this. This is part of what led to the fake news issues. It's leading to a lot of other issues in many different contexts. Another context comes up in my second example. So this is Eric Loomis. Eric Loomis is a convicted felon. He was convicted of a felony in the state of Wisconsin. And when he went for sentencing, the judge in his case used an algorithm called Compass to influence his sentencing. Compass tries to predict how likely a person is to reoffend, to commit another crime in the future. In Eric's case, he was predicted to be highly likely to reoffend. He was actually a convicted sex offender before this. And so he got a very long sentence in prison. And he challenged this in court because this algorithm is proprietary. It's not available to the public. There's no way to inspect it, to figure out whether it's trustworthy or reliable. It went all the way to the Supreme Court of Wisconsin, who ruled that it was legal that they do this as long as that's not the only thing that they use in sentencing him. Partially in response to this case and a couple of other cases, ProPublica went through and tried to analyze how this algorithm works and try to understand and figure out how it works. And they came up with a really startling conclusion. When they looked and compared African American criminals with white criminals, they found that African Americans were very consistently predicted to be much higher likelihood to reoffend. So then this was actually predictably leading judges to give them much longer sentences in prison for equivalent crimes. And so this was a big deal. The company that made this algorithm used to be called North Point. They changed their name after this. But the company used to be called North Point. They got a lot of bad press about this, but they actually had a really interesting reaction. And the reaction to me is more interesting than the algorithm. Their reaction was basically, yes, our algorithm does this, but it's not biased. And they were trying to argue that their algorithm isn't biased because in their data, African Americans are more likely to reoffend. And they had data that showed that the African Americans that they were studying were more likely to reoffend than the whites that were in their data, and therefore they were not actually, the algorithm was not biased against African Americans, but instead that they were reflecting what was going on in the real world. Turns out though, by reoffend, their definition of reoffend was really interesting because it wasn't commit another crime. That's really hard to measure. They measured how likely they were to commit another crime by how likely they were to get arrested again. And arrests are a human process that have racial biases in them. And so the underlying data was what was biased, that they based the algorithm on, as opposed to some bias in the algorithm itself. So when they looked at their algorithm, they didn't see a biased algorithm. It was accurately reflecting the biases in the real world. That's a really interesting challenge that's really difficult to deal with in algorithms, is how do you design algorithms that do what we want them to do as opposed to reflect the challenges and problems that are already existent in the real world. To compound these issues that are coming up in algorithms, we're seeing also another problem with algorithms, with a lot of the modern machine learning based algorithms that turns out is really, really difficult to stop. So this is a photograph of a panda. Pandas are pretty simple, and it turns out this photograph in particular is a really common photograph among machine learning researchers who are designing algorithms for computer vision that recognize what is in a photograph. And so it's really easy now, we have a ton of algorithms that can recognize that this is a photograph of a panda. It also turns out that one of the things that we can do is we can modify this image. So this is an example of, we take the image and apply the algorithm and it says it's a panda with 60% confidence. If we take and add to that something that looks like random noise but is actually carefully chosen, the algorithm will come out and say, this is a gibbon, a type of monkey, with 99% confidence. Other people have turned this photograph into a llama or a camel or a giraffe or a couple other different things. The basic problem is that most of our machine learning algorithms have this kind of fragility. They're kind of fragile, and there are a lot of cases where if we modify them in a specific way, then what humans perceive and what the algorithms perceive turn out to not be the same thing. And so we can create situations where the algorithm perceives something different than what the humans perceive. This is also really difficult to stop. The way a lot of these algorithms work, it's really difficult to stop this and to make robust algorithms. It's really easy to find these, and it's really hard to stop these. And this is becoming more and more of a problem as we use algorithms in more situations. They're also open to this type of gaming and this type of manipulation. We're also seeing a lot of really interesting cases where people are fighting back against algorithms that are then changing the underlying data. So some of my favorite examples, there was a paper recently about how people are doing what they're calling Voldemorting. They're referring to something by another name. So instead of calling him Voldemort, they say, you know who, or he who must not be named. Another example is there's a really interesting recent art exhibit in New York City. An artist tried to design hair and makeup styles that were resistant to facial detection. And so all 4 of these pictures, if you run them through most of the modern facial detection algorithms, will say that there is not a human being in these pictures. And that's really interesting to try to think about how the world is changing in response to these algorithms. Thank you.
Is this on already? No.
Here we have this one.
Okay. That shows you how technologically adept I am. So I guess it's fitting that our first 2 scholars tonight talked about science, and the last 2 are going to talk more about technology rather than science per se. So I want to talk a little bit about values. In particular, I want to talk about the value or values of cautionary tales. So, you all have heard cautionary tales. Growing up, you've probably read Aesop's Fables and the Brothers Grimm. Some of you have had a class in Greek mythology. But basically, like, your textbook definition is a cautionary tale is some sort of folklore or fable, a parable, a proverb, something like that, that's meant to warn an audience about some danger, about a risk. So it's usually a story where one of the characters, typically the main character, does something wrong, does something really wrong, violates a taboo or some sort of prohibition against doing something, and then they face a terrible fate. So let's take a deep dive into some famous cautionary tales. So let's start back with Icarus. Icarus, of course, is a son of Daedalus. Icarus tries to escape Crete by creating wings of feather and wax. What happened to Icarus? Just shout it out. Yeah, you flew too close to the sun. So the sun heats the wax and he comes tumbling down and dies in the sea. Cautionary tale. Another cautionary tale you might not know from the portrait here. Well, I guess it's not a portrait, but a painting. Prometheus. He steals fire from the gods on Mount Olympus and gives it to humanity to help bolster or foster progress in civilization. What happens to Prometheus? Yes. Doesn't sound like a very nice fate. He's tied to a rock, and every day an eagle starts to eat away at his liver. The next day, it happens all over again and all over again for eternity. Another cautionary tale. Now we have Pandora. Pandora, of course, is Earth's first woman. So Zeus gives Pandora to Prometheus' brother, Epimetheus, even though Prometheus says, don't take any gifts, especially not from Zeus. What happens to Epimetheus? Or what happens with Pandora? Yeah. It's actually a jar, but we'll let that go, right? You know, translation and everything. So she gives Epimetheus her jar, opens it up, and releases all the evils of humanity. That doesn't sound so good. Now we have Faust. So Faust is this pretty successful, but ultimately sort of like less than fully satisfied scholar. He wants it all. He wants great knowledge, great success. What happens to Faust? Yeah. So the devil's got too much work going on, probably down at Ann Arbor. And he decides, I got this helper Mephistopheles, I'm just going to send him. And he makes the bargain with Faust, saying, I'll give you all that, but for the price of your soul, and then you'll be a slave in hell for all of eternity. Not so good. And then perhaps one of the most famous ones, especially in terms of science fiction and our modern concerns about technology, good old Victor Frankenstein creates a monster, a hideous monster, through vivisection and then experimentation. What happens to Victor? Yeah, someone made the back here. Yep. So he not only dies, but first his monster, his creation, kills his brother, then his childhood friend, then his fiancée, and then Victor dies chasing his monster around the North Pole. So all of these lend phrases, catchphrases, quotes into modern culture, at least modern Western culture. We often use these over and over. We talk about Frankenfood and opening Pandora's box. You may have used these like just in this past week to describe something like, oh, don't do that, don't go that far. You're flying too close to the sun or something like that. I'm really interested in a lot of emerging technology, and so I've taught a class a couple times on different emerging technologies, which is one of the reasons I think I was invited to be on this panel. So artificial intelligence is in a lot of our lives, whether we know it or not. And modern culture, at least going back several decades up to just a couple years ago, is producing cautionary tales about AI, whether they're good movies or not so good movies. I don't think there's a Michael Bay movie up there. I don't know. I'm not sure. But each of these movies, if you've seen them, you'll realize it's some sort of warning about going too far, too fast, not being humble enough, maybe getting too arrogant about ourselves and our inventions. So I want to take a step back and put all of this in a little bit of context and sort of make use of the anthropology minor I got 20-some years ago. So if we talk about human evolution, I guess this goes back to Dr. Montgomery's first talk. You might think at a very general level that human evolution is shaped by these opposing forces. So you have maybe individuals, groups, organizations, societies that are willing to take big risks, venture into the unknown, advocate for change, and maybe they value innovation and exploration, invention, try out something new. Let's do something no one's ever done before. But at the same time, maybe in that society, there are individuals, groups, organizations that are risk averse, and they prefer order and stability or stasis. And they value looking towards the past, looking at tradition, practicing rituals, not looking forward, not running into the unknown full speed ahead, but trying to get back to where we were in the past when things were more stable and known and comfortable. So you could imagine this playing out, maybe not among us well-dressed folks tonight, but all the way back in the caveman ages or cave person ages. These just happen to be three dudes, right? So you could imagine there's these three cavemen. They're just walking around the savannah. It's like, hey, hear that in the bush? Let's go get it. It might be food, right? There's your risk seeker. He wants to run into the unknown because it might be a good food source, right? It's like, bruh, you always say that. And it's usually something that can kill us. So caution, let's slow down. Maybe let's just go back to camp, go back to the cave, right? So jumping forward to the current day, at least in the last 100 years or so, this ideology of technological progressivism is pretty widespread, especially in the United States. So by technological progressivism, I mean this idea or ideology or belief system, this strongly held worldview, that technology doesn't just produce progress, that technology itself is progress. When a new thing comes out, be it a phone, a computer, a robot, that is good in and of itself. It's good just because it's new. It's progress manifested in this thing, usually. Sometimes it's a non-tangible thing like a code. It's a belief that technological development is sort of internally self-propelled. It's always for the better. And by definition, then, newer versions of technologies are inherently better than older versions. And it seems self-evident. A refrigerator these days is so much better than a refrigerator 50 years ago. It's probably better than 10 years ago. And so this ideology is very strong in our culture and in other cultures, but we Americans, it's probably the strongest among other societies. So if you think of cultural evolution of societies, especially those societies where scientists and engineers are routinely putting out new discoveries and new technologies, you might think about now the two groups might be captured by this ideology of technological progressivism, of almost as a reflex. If you say the word technological, half the people in here will say advancement or technological progress. It just sort of comes as a reflex. Like, we don't know what else to say after that, but advancement, because that's what technology is. And that high tech is better than low tech. And anyone who says, well, let's be cautious, they're just chicken littles, they're naysayers, they're irrational. It's like, you don't understand the facts of this, to what Dr. Elliott was saying. But then we have all these cautionary tales that are maybe preventing us from going too fast into the future or taking on too many risks with unknown technologies. And so I would basically argue that the cautionary tales in our society that keep popping up are some sort of a check or a countervailing force to mitigate or to slow down or to weaken the influence of this progressivism. And I am just going to skip and get to the very end. I know I'm a little over. So I just wanted to show you in this year, 2018, the relevance of these cautionary tales. So it was a 200th anniversary of Mary Shelley's book, Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. And so the January 12th issue of Science, the cover story was Frankenstein, and all sorts of other stories inside talked about the modern relevance of Frankenstein in talking about science and technology. You've probably seen lots of Boston Dynamics robots recently. This was the dog that could open a door. The one that was doing parkour just a couple weeks ago, that terrifies me. But you could see in very small print, this was called the latest Promethean creation. Here's a story about CRISPR-Cas9, gene editing. And encircled, it's called, perhaps, Are We Opening Pandora's Box? This article is talking about how adopting Facebook in Africa might be opening up a Faustian bargain in terms of all the information that Facebook is gathering in big data analysis. For those of you who've been around campus, you see all the scooters and stuff. Well, evidently, Charleston has a problem with scooters, and so they're saying, like, are these bird scooters flying too close to the sun? That's a sort of a lame headline, but you get the idea. So I'll just leave with this. If I think we need to talk about big questions, I would throw these three out there. So whenever we talk about a new technology, be it a big system, a specific artifact, a way of knowing, a way of doing, I would say, to what extent does this new technology actually facilitate real societal progress? And progress is probably another word we can define, but we can leave that for later. And then to what extent is control of this technology associated with power? It could help the powerless gain control. It could also help very powerful people monopolize or shore up their control and exercise their control over others. And then finally, how can we accurately perceive and manage the risks associated with these new technologies? At the very least, to prevent the most serious high consequence risks. And I'll just leave it at that.
I'd like to thank all four panelists, and just watching you as an audience, you seem to be very engaged, unless you were fooling me. But we're going to give you a chance to interact with the panelists. But before I do that, only one of the presenters had a chance to hear from all of the others before they presented. So are there any interaction you'd like to have with each other? Or was there something you really wanted to say and didn't have time to say before we go into our question and answer?
Okay. Just one of the things that struck me how, and this was the first time we all heard each other's talks, I wrote in a circle here in my margin for all four talks, power, 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 power. And I just think power dynamics, be it talking about science or being talking about technology, that was for me the key thread that ran through the panel.
Just a quick comment would be that I think part of what makes this such an interesting topic is that there isn't a nice, simple answer like that we should always be trusting of science and technology, or we should always be respecting and trusting those who are doubting it. I thought that Professor McCright's talk especially brought that out, the fact that we see the value of progress and we see the value of questioning. And I was kind of pointing that out early on with our talks, the ways in which there can be problems to being too respectful of the scientific ideas of the day, but there can also be problems to being overly skeptical, and it's very complicated to figure out how to address these issues. So I think that's part of what makes this interesting.
Okay, well, what I'm going to do is, if I were sitting out there, I would have had a lot of questions, but I'm not out there. The next phase of this, we'll have Professor John Beck, and he is with the School of Human Resources and Labor Relations, and he has a lot of credentials, but particularly for this event, he's an expert in training and development and also in workforce development. And he's going to facilitate our question and answer period.
That's a nice way of saying that I'm going to walk around with the microphone, which is one way for chubby older professors to get exercise. So thank you for that. So do raise your hands. One thing I would lay out, the power is a great, I think, synthesis. But beyond that, think of the fact that naturally next week, or very soon, is Halloween. And it's like, no. We always look at the horror films and go, don't open that door, which is to Aaron's point. So raise your hands, and I'll come around to you. Who has a question? Okay, I'm coming.
Dr. Wash, you mentioned the limitations of the compass evaluation in judging, and I worked with ex-offenders, and so I'm aware of how the compass information was gathered from the inmates, and that also is somewhat flawed. But my question is, are you aware of how police agencies are using an algorithm, no doubt, called predictive policing? Mm-hmm. Yeah, would you compare that pretty much with a very flawed way, a very biased way of saying that there's always crimes in the Waverly Jolly area of Lansing, and so we're going to send a lot of police people over there because those black people are always committing black on black crimes? It drives me crazy.
Comments?
Yes, I think and that's actually that's one of the things I almost talked about, but I decided I didn't want to talk too much about policing. But there's a really interesting example that comes from a colleague of mine who works in Milwaukee. And he's been working with police agencies to study how they're using predictive policing. And I really like the example he uses. He went in and he sat down with two police officers who they actually weren't police officers. They were recent criminology graduates from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And they had just gotten their master's degree. They got hired because they had technology skills, and they were given this algorithm to do predictive policing. And the algorithm was trying to create clusters of where should we send police. And he asked them, all right, so part of the algorithm is you have to tell it how many clusters you are. How did you choose to use 5 clusters? And their answer was, well, I went to my sergeant, and he said that there's basically 5 different areas of the city, and so I used 5 clusters. And in this case, they're basically giving technological credibility to what the police were already doing. And so that's one of the real challenges as these algorithms become more common. They also need to be able to be usable by people who aren't PhDs, and be able to be valuable in that way instead of just kind of reinforcing what we already have.
Okay.
Yes.
Other questions? Okay.
I'll just follow up because I love making connections to movies. So if we think about Compass and predictive policing, I guess someone might say that there's like the fatal flaw in both of those are the underlying data, right? It's sort of the input is flawed. If you guys have ever seen the movie Minority Report, not the not so great TV show, that's the essence of the warning in Minority Report. So the main precog, the female precog, it was the murder of her mother that facilitated the continuation of pre-crime that gave, I can't remember the guy in charge, that gave him the power to run this pre-crime unit. So at one level, we're talking about a science fiction scenario where we're trying to predict who's going to do what before they do it, which is sort of like what some of these algorithms are doing, either predicting recidivism or predicting crime to begin with. And that's sort of captured in the movie Minority Report. But also the same cautionary tale of if something is flawed from the very beginning, no matter how good your intentions, it might still be flawed throughout. So it's sort of like the lawyer term of it's fruit from the poison tree. It could never quite be fixed. It's always in there. It's built into the system, that flaw.
For Dr. McCright and Dr. Elliott, I just sort of noticed the similarity between the role of the cautionary tale and doubting science. So I want to know, in your opinion, what is the role of the cautionary tale? Is it harmful, or do you believe there is just a balance to be struck? And you guys sort of implied this. You had brought up, Dr. Elliott, questioning or harping on facts as harmful. Would you argue that cautionary tales in the same way are sort of a cop-out in journalism of just another token phrase to use over and over again?
So what I end up thinking about when I hear the cautionary tale, because of my work related to environmental pollution, is the precautionary principle, which is an idea that comes up a lot with environmental policy and regulation, which is the suggestion that even if the science isn't all settled, even if you don't have all the a precise sort of causal story laid out, that it's still appropriate to take action to prevent serious threats of various sorts. And what's really interesting, again, as I was mentioning earlier, it would be nice if we could come up with a simple solution and say, yes, we can always be precautionary, and that's the way to go. In some ways, I think it does, it moves in the direction I was suggesting, not getting lost in a tangle of facts and saying we've got to get all these facts figured out before we can do something. So in that respect, I think that this sort of cautionary or precautionary approach is valuable. But it would be, I think, too simple to say we can solve our problems with it, because it raises all these other difficult questions. What sorts of threats are serious enough that we're willing to apply the precautionary principle? We probably can't just apply it to everything. And how much and what kinds of evidence would we want to see before we would trigger this kind of precautionary principle? And what kinds of actions would be appropriate in response? So it creates this tangle of further questions, which I guess is kind of, again, fits with Professor McCright's point that we've got this realization that, caution is warranted, but it gets awfully tricky to figure out, sort of how to actually implement it effectively. So that would be some initial thoughts.
Other comments?
Yeah, I'm having an old man moment right here, but I'll say one thing that I can remember. So I just as well could have sat up here and given a talk about climate change denial, because I've been studying that for a while. I just didn't want to, because I'm sort of tired of talking about it. Even though it's not going away, I just don't know what other new stuff to say about it. So from what Dr. Elliott brought up, and Dr. Montgomery brought up with regards to science, there's different reasons why we might want to doubt or be skeptical of different arguments or different pieces of evidence within science. I have focused most of my attention in my career on sort of organized climate change denial, whether it's the fossil fuels industry or conservative think tanks or certain politicians. And the motivations for that skepticism or contrarianism or denial. It's almost never because the people I just mentioned or the groups I just mentioned want to get the science right, because they have at the core of their endeavor, we want to make sure that we have the actual truth. It's usually they are attacking science or critiquing science or trying to poke holes in science because they're concerned about the regulatory intervention into the market, some sort of regulation or tax that might result once policymakers understand the nature of the science. So if science says we're causing this problem and it's big and it's not something that the market could readily solve on its own, then that's going to require some sort of governmental intervention. And of course, if it's climate change and it's global, that means not just a state or a county or a country, but many countries have to be involved. And that really flies in the face of some core values, especially for US conservatives and US libertarians. And so that's why you see them doubting or being skeptical or denying climate change or the science of climate change. Not because they're in it to make sure scientists get it right and they're really concerned about, peer review and so on. They're just using attacks on science, or they're just using science as a proxy for what they really want to talk about, which is values, their worldview. So this solution is antithetical to the values we hold about private property rights and limited government and free market. And it's maybe easier now to deny the science than to have those battles once we've accepted that the problem exists. Because then people want you to do something, and that often means government intervention.
Okay, we have a question right here.
A house divided cannot stand, and I think that's a big part of where we seem to be in this country right now, about 50% or so on each side, 40, 60. We seem to be talking past each other, and I think possibly part of it might be that on the one side you have a very religious-oriented or faith belief type of approach to life, and the other side is more fact-based. So my question is, how do we bridge the gap and actually be able to communicate where we can actually start talking to each other and solving the problems that we have? Because right now, we just talk right past each other. We're not even on the same frequency.
Go for it. Yeah. That's a big question. And I wish I could solve it. I can't. I'll tell you one historical antidote that speaks to what you were just talking about. I'm British. You may have noticed that. I am also a US citizen. I'm just going to say that right now. And I will be voting on November 6th. So I grew up reading a fairy tale called The Water Babies. And I actually collect special issues of the Water Babies book now. And The Water Babies is a fairy tale, written in the 19th century by Reverend Charles Kingsley, who was friends with Charles Darwin. And it was written, it's a thick fairy tale, much longer than those books we read kids nowadays, to teach children that they could believe in Darwinian evolution and Christianity. And it had a figure called Mother Carey, who was a female representation of God. And she made the animals make themselves. So she made the mechanism of natural selection and then sat back and let that mechanism make all the different organisms in the world rather than bothering to individually create individual organisms, which is what was believed at the time. And one of the reasons I think I really still like to read that book, I mean, it's a beautiful illustrated book, and two scholars, Piers Hale and John Beattie, are actually analyzing, they're historians of science that are writing a book about water babies, is I think it does a really beautiful job, actually, of bringing together those two sides of a debate that nowadays is a schism for many people, as Dr. Elliott was talking about too. So maybe there's something that we can learn from. It's an example, I think, of meeting in the middle and talking. Unfortunately, it's from the 19th century.
So I also don't have easy solutions. It's a really interesting question, but it does relate a little bit to something I was just thinking about before you raised the question, which is another connection between a lot of these talks is ways in which values of various sorts are intertwined with the science or the facts. So I was thinking about Dr. Montgomery pointing out that Darwin was, his thinking, he was doing this science, but he was very influenced by the values and perspectives of that time. And then if we think about Dr. Walsh's discussion about algorithms, we were seeing how, the algorithms depend on what's put in and the values that go into how they decide what the right inputs and so on are. And of course, Dr. McCright was, emphasizing these very value-laden perspectives on, our views about technology. And I would say, one of my themes in my research is the roles that values play in science, and especially in this policy relevant science where the science isn't settled. And so much depends on, sort of various interpretive judgments and so on. So I don't know, maybe one way to think a little bit about your question is, while we like to think about the values or and the facts being really distinct, that in actual practice, there's this fascinating, ways in which they end up meshing together. I don't know if understanding that better would help us. And just one last comment, as Dr. McCright was just pointing out, often we may use factual arguments, sort of as a sort of a surrogate for these values that are really underlying it. So we say we're all concerned about the details of the science of climate change, but really the debate is about these political values and so on. So anyway, it's a tough issue, but it's really interesting how these issues are actually intertwined in practice, I think.
Other comments up there on that question?
I'll just chime in, because I'm a sociologist and we like to think we're really smart and know all the answers. But I'll at least add some context. So if we think about why there's so much polarization, why there's so much unrest and incivility and so on, I think some of that can be explained by the larger global context of rapid social change, rapid economic change. So just what we think it means to be masculine and feminine is really changing in terms of evolution very quickly. Now, in terms of like young adults, it seems like things are taking forever to actually change. But the whole idea of gender fluidity, for people who have maybe less hair in the room or a little whiter hair, that probably sounds pretty foreign. So in the last couple decades, the U.S. culture, the U.S. economy has undergone rapid change. That means some people who aren't as adept to handling change, or some groups that want to have things like the old way or defend the previous system, whether it's patriarchy, capitalism, whatever, that is being changed, they get threatened, right? Their worldview is threatened. Their economic position is threatened. We saw this in a lot of the discussion about why do people vote against their economic interests. Well, it's not just about economic interests. It's your religious interests. It's your interests about your masculinity. It's all sorts of other things. And so in times of rapid change, sometimes people just throw their hands up and like, well, what am I supposed to do now? How am I supposed to talk to people now? So you can see the frustration on people's faces. And if we were living in a time in which there wasn't as much change, or at least it didn't seem to happen as fast, I think we'd be able to sit down and have conversations. So the piece of advice I would give is something I try to do when I bring people together to talk about controversial subjects. Before I even let them know like what we're going to be talking about, I just have them get on a piece of scratch paper and just say, write down your core values, what you really value. and they'd be writing for a few minutes, and then talk to the person next to you about what they value, and you realize there's a lot of overlap in our values. You know, almost everyone wants their kids to have a great life, not a bunch of ordeals, lots of health problems. They want their kids to go to college, have a good job, meet someone, fall in love, have everything. That's something, for the most part, we all have in common, right? Some people, you know, have other things they want out of life, but our shared values are pretty strong. Those just aren't the topics of conversation on the news or in politics. Very few people are talking about what we share in common, because I don't think that gets out the vote. I don't think that sells newspapers. I don't think that gets people to click on links, right? What gets people to do all those things are controversy and drama and friction. So I think in the midst of all that, we shouldn't lose track of what we share in common.
Okay, we have a question right here.
My question is also about the conflict between evolution and religion. So I went to a private Catholic high school, and evolution was something that wasn't necessarily refuted in my classes, but just something that wasn't even brought to the table, like it wasn't a part of the course material. So my question was, are there any procedures that are being put in place today, specifically targeting religious high schools and like trying to facilitate a discussion about evolution in science classes? Or are there any studies that are being done about this today, and would this be a relevant like age group to look at when talking about that conflict?
So there's a lot of people looking at debates about teaching Darwin and evolution in schools versus and/or intelligent design. I mean, it changes a lot based on geographical location. It changes a lot depending whether you're looking at public education or private schools. I would suspect private schools have a lot more autonomy about what they do or do not teach. I would hope that if Darwinian evolution is presented as one of multiple potential theories for evolution, which it may be in some school contexts, it kind of goes back to what Dr. Elliott talked about too, about how science is tentative, and by which science is a theory. It's true that Darwin is a theory of evolution by natural selection, right? And but my worry is, because people like to think of science as this very linear, definite thing, that to say it's tentative or to say it's a theory somehow undermines its authority or undermines the fact that it remains the most compelling theory out there. So I think part of it is training young people as well about the complexities and the reality of how science is actually done, while simultaneously not therefore removing all of its legitimacy or value. Because, you know, rational is seen as better than emotional. There's a lot of gender that goes behind those value claims too, right? Tentative is seen as problematic, definite and permanent is seen as right. Truth with a capital T versus truth with a little t. It's difficult to teach those things K through 12. I think they can be taught K through 12, and I say that as a mother of an 8-year-old and a 2-year-old. I confess I haven't taught the 2-year-old yet, but the 8-year-old is able to understand a lot of these complicated power dynamics. Similarly, the historical methods, such as historical empathy that I talked about, which I'm teaching in my history methods class right now, we look at how to teach kids K through 12 some of those more complicated ideas of historical methods too.
So that's a really good answer. I don't know that I have a lot to add. And I'm hoping I'm not blanking on what I was thinking I could possibly add. I think it was basically that, so again, a lot of this, I think, gets back to the question of, so with the issue of intelligent design and so on, there's been, and with creation science before that, there was a lot of argument that we ought to teach the controversy, or that we need to present, you know, sort of multiple perspectives and so on. What I think is interesting, you know, you talked about coming from a more religious or private, you know, sort of high school context. So I think one of the worries I would have in a public context in a biology class of, you know, teaching the controversy is that there we need to actually consider, what's the goal of a biology class, and the goal of the biology class, even given my points about the tentativeness of science, is to teach our best biological understanding. And so if you've got a really high quality biological theory, and then you've got some really not very well developed kind of speculative suggestions, it doesn't make a lot of sense to sort of, give the two equal time. But I do think what's interesting is in that kind of religious high school context, it could be an opportunity to explore some really interesting kind of, history or philosophy of science, or, connections between science and religion. So in the biology context, I think it really makes sense to focus on the quality biological theory, but one could really develop a lot of interesting sophistication on the part of the students, thinking more about historically different ways of relating, say, religious perspectives with the science. And I think it could actually alleviate some of the concerns if one understands more of the historical context, that, a lot of the kind of stress about the conflict between the two is a much more kind of recent phenomenon, sort of the past 100 years or so, and that there could be a lot of other more creative ways to relate the two. So.
Yeah, please do. And in addition, I think a great way to alleviate some of the stresses of the conversation would be to step back and have a bit more of a global perspective. I mean, just in the UK, Charles Darwin's on the 10-pound note. It's not to say that everybody in the UK doesn't have religious beliefs. So, I mean, to step back and sort of have that perspective, I think, can be helpful too.
Let me just throw in something just for the fun of it, which is that I think that the question really alludes to the idea that these have been dueling certainty systems. You move from one definition of certainty to another definition of certainty, which is why there was a question mark on the end of doubting science and technology question mark. Because the fact that we've accepted that really science is such a strong certainty system, some people gravitate to that and really eschew the whole idea that science is not a certainty system at all. I mean, I think that you're really raising that it often raises more questions than it actually answers. And if we look at that, how do we get people from moving from straight certainty to actually harboring a constructive feeling of doubt rather than automatically flopping from one certainty system, in effect, to another certainty system? We had a question right here. Oh, okay. Oh, right here.
Hi. So my question is mainly for Dr. Wash. You mentioned algorithms and how they tend to be faulty. The example that I really enjoyed you using was YouTube and YouTube Kids and some of the awful things that have kind of come about because of an algorithm making the choices as to what children can watch or not watch. I think part of the challenge that YouTube and Google in general is having is because they're putting out these kind of faulty and semi-efficient algorithms to be making these decisions. So my question is along the lines of, if you're a company like Google, for example, producing YouTube, do you double down on the human element and having somebody like physically there checking the algorithm, making sure that it's making the correct decisions? Or do you think society is leading to us creating a machine that is always right and thus will eliminate any need for human interaction? Or is there a compromise between the two? Between having a society that's the technology that's always checked up on humans and technology that is self-sufficient?
So I can tell you Google has a really quick answer to that, which is it would take more people than we have in the US to watch all of the videos being produced. So they can't possibly do it with solely human technology. More interestingly, I want to go back to Dr. Elliott's point that these tech companies, so science embeds values of the scientists in the results. Technology is the same way. And so the values that the people who are creating the technology possess gets embedded in the designs and how they work. And so YouTube has actually been concerned about children and what they watch since the very beginning because, as you pointed out, everyone is worried about their kids. That's a really important value that is actually really shared. And the political values have not been embedded in like Facebook for a long time because that is a controversial value, and it was not one that was shared amongst the people who created that technology. I think the fundamental question then is, what values do the people who are creating and building that technology have, and how do those values end up manifesting through the technology and the designs and the algorithms and the choice of the data and the choice of which algorithm to use and when to use it and how strongly to use it. So is it recommendation or a requirement? Things like that. Those values really come through very, very strongly. And having a diverse group of people that have different values as inputs seems to be one of the, so changing the process of development to have a diverse group of people that are inputting into those seems to be one of the stronger ways to deal with that.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. Go right down.
Regarding the most recent climate change report that kind of claimed that we need to reduce levels by 40 to 50% or something by 2030. One perspective that I read on this was that this report did more harm than good, because rather than kind of motivating people into action, it scared people into defeat. And so my question is, how do you think that we can use such harsh information in reports in policy in such a way that they, instead of kind of promoting this defeatist attitude, or how can we use them in our creative solutions that Dr. Elliott mentioned, or just in general, to create climate change policy?
Even though I brought this stuff up, I'd like to hear what the social scientists have to say. I mean, this is the perfect question for a communications scholar or somebody who's doing the empirical stuff. So,
or someone who wrote a book called A Tapestry of Values.
Yeah. Well, I might be able to talk about the values, but the question of how to address those, those reports in thoughtful ways, I still think it's a better question for these guys, and I can jump in after if I have any other thoughts.
So there are a lot of communication scholars and social scientists in general who have worked for the last couple decades on how to message climate science to the public. What's the content of the message? What's the medium of the message? Who's the messenger? Who are trusted messengers? And if you look at risk communication research and health communication research, there are several principles that is just sort of like best practices. And, there's simple things like use trusted messengers and try to turn whatever it is you're talking about into an opportunity. So, if I was made, let's say, climate czar or something, maybe not now, but let's say 10, 15 years ago when we had more flexibility in what we could do, I would have just said, this is a beginning of the next American century. We can be the country in the world that creates a whole wide range of new intellectual property to solve problems like climate change. Some of them will be civil engineering, some of how we design houses, food production systems, alternative energy, batteries. We could be the forefront of change, and thus, if we have the patents and everything, then people in other countries are gonna want those. Right now, we're not the world's leader in windmills. We're not the world's leader in solar. Other countries are beating us to it because they have more of a national priority. We have an okay solar panel industry. We have an okay wind turbine industry, but we haven't made trying to grow those areas a priority. And so, you could look at climate change as the biggest problem humans have created since we've been on Earth, and most people would say, if they've seen the science, it's like, yeah, that's true. But it could be turned into an opportunity to radically rethink how we live. So if you bring it down to someone's level, do you really want to spend 2 hours driving or 1 hour driving to work, 1 hour driving back, just to make all the money to buy all the stuff you don't really want, that doesn't really make you happy, that takes you away from spending time with your kids, and just start questioning all that? Do you need the second house? Is that going to make you happy? Maybe, whatever. But if we start saying climate change might be the opening of the door that lets us to have bigger questions about what is the good life, right? It's usually not acquiring more stuff or burning more carbon. Up to a certain level, yeah, but continuing to burn and burn and burn, it doesn't give us that much more marginal happiness or whatever. So, you know, I would make this into a positive message and say, we could strengthen our national security if we weaned ourselves off of foreign oil and made every part of our military self-sufficient in terms of their energy use and their water consumption. I think anytime we put troops in some forward area, you also have to think, how's the food getting to them? How's the energy getting to them? How's the equipment getting to them? What if we stopped powering all those vehicles on air, water, and sea by, or land, I guess I forgot that, by fossil fuels and made them solar or something else where they could be totally self-sufficient? You don't have to worry about a supply chain getting cut off. You could keep going as long as there's sun or some other energy source. That would make for a very nimble military instead of sort of the, I wouldn't say albatross, but sort of like an albatross. If we have to put 500,000 people in some foreign country, that is a lot of stuff we have to take with them. And then every few weeks, constantly keep bringing more stuff. Not that we should be fighting wars, by the way.
I think that's
a philosopher could have said all of what I just said.
No, I still think it's better coming from the sociologists.
So I kind of wanted to go back to the idea of values being so tied up in science today, and kind of raise the question to you of what responsibility do you think Michigan State University and other universities and just in general academic institutions have, especially in the education of their STEM majors and related fields? What responsibility do you think those institutions have in making their students more aware of this tie-up of values in science, and what actions do you think can be taken by those institutions to ensure that the progress that we see, or progress we see in technology is truly beneficial to humanity?
Well, as one of the two Lyman Briggs College professors on the panel, I think it's an absolute requirement that a new generation of STEM scientists receive an interdisciplinary education that includes perspectives from the humanities and social sciences. The fact of the matter is the kind of wicked problems that Dr. Elliott listed at the beginning of his presentation either cannot be solved within one disciplinary bound. So I think it's essential. I mean, in Lyman Briggs particularly, you know, all of our students do take classes in the history, philosophy, and sociology of science. Clearly some Briggsies in the room here based on the response. So, you know, they're doing freshman class as an introduction, and then a senior seminar as a capstone, and some 300 other classes. I think it's very important if you're going into medicine to realize the history of how populations have been exploited by medical professionals, to understand ideas of trust. I think it's incredibly important to understand ideas of ethics, of public policy. I mean, this is the lived reality of scientists. And to really have a thoughtful understanding of the scientific method, that I think to understand the scientific method in a really robust way, as funny as this might sound, involves interacting with the humanities and social studies, to think about the values in those words of things like tentative, speculative, collaboration. As Kevin and I Dr. Elliott and I look at ideas of authorship, data sharing, credit, and also ideas of inclusion and diversity and the ethics of that.
Since Dr. McCright was so nice to advertise my book, Tapestry of Values, I do offer
Is there an Amazon link?
Well, I can get that up here quick. No, I do offer 3 suggestions in there for responding to the value-ladenness of science. So one is sometimes tricky to implement, and this kind of came out in Dr. Wash's discussion about algorithms. I think where possible, it's helpful for us to see if we can be more transparent in various ways about value issues in science or technology, but sometimes that's not always feasible. He really nicely pointed out. But this is where I think sometimes that what Dr. Montgomery's point about that sort of humanistic or more social scientific reflection on science can sometimes bring those to light, as Dr. Wash really nicely did here. But then also I think we need to be reflecting on what values we want to be influencing science if we are recognizing it. And that's where, again, Dr. Wash's point, he was talking about the need for diversity, these diverse perspectives. And, that's something that Dr. Montgomery thinks a lot about, how we can promote a more diverse scientific workforce. If there are these values embedded, and if we're not always aware of them, well, then it becomes really important to have a range of people with different kinds of experiences and backgrounds in informing our science. And then finally, I think if we can find ways, and again, these aren't always easy to pull off, but more fruitful engagement between the scientific community and others. So there are really interesting, steps being taken in some areas of science, for example, to have citizen science, to have more engagement between researchers and members of the public where their work may be affecting them. I was just on a conference call earlier today related to issues related to environmental health research, and the Institute of the National Institutes of Health that focuses on that is really interested in environmental justice and the ways in which their science is affecting communities and how they can link up researchers with those communities. So, so those would be 3 points I would make. Exploring transparency where we can, exploring diversity where we can, and exploring engagement where we can between the scientific community and others.
I completely agree with everything, and I just want to add that technology is not immune from that, and there seems to be a little bit more conversation about the values that science and scientists bring to their endeavors, but there seems to be a kind of perception that technology is this value-neutral thing that just happens and is a good thing, and that is absolutely not true. And the values that technologists bring to the table in choosing what to do and what to work on, what problems are important, what problems are not important, is just as important. I like my favorite example is Apple. When they came out with the Apple Watch, they had a health tracking app that was able to track all kinds of different health-related things. You could track your heart rate, it could track your exercise, it could track all kinds of things. And the engineers in Silicon Valley somehow forgot to track menstrual cycles.
Well, I think we'll take one last question here. Was there one of you? And then we're going to turn it back over to Dr. June to kind of take us out of here, maybe last comments from the panel.
This is more so for Dr. Montgomery. So your research talk on Darwin had this key theme of diversity and inclusion. And having seen your devotion to diversity and inclusion, do you think that this topic was transformative for you, and has it allowed you to understand more so the faculty role in diversity and inclusion in science?
Oh, that's a big question, Malcolm. Well, I'll have the caveat as well that as much as this is about inclusion and diversity, they were all middle upper class white women in the 19th century. Just want to have that as a caveat. It was the first time I researched something when everything I read to write that article I made into a course, because I was reading it all and I was like, this is such incredible stuff, and it would translate great. Literally every single reading for my gender and evolution, I'm giving it all away now, are things that I cite and use for my essay. So in that way, it was a much more direct translation from my research to my teaching, probably part of a broader professional development piece of when I started getting more and more committed to issues of inclusion and diversity here at Michigan State, in my committee work, in my service, in my teaching, and in my research, which I certainly do. It means an awful lot to me that every single person that I teach, if they want to be a scientist, sees themselves in science. And that's why my 133 right now is, we've redone all the exhibits in the planetarium. I'll give a little plug out for Abrams Planetarium on campus. Only had depictions of the work of white men. And when I went there with my 2 daughters and sat to see the show with a bunch of little girls and realized none of them saw themselves in the lobby, reached out to the director who really wanted more diversity and inclusion in the exhibits but didn't have the person power or the money to do so, now has 5 amazing new exhibits made by Briggs students to really celebrate diversity and inclusion in that space. And that's an example, going back to this gentleman's question too, about really making the public spaces on campus celebrate diversity and inclusion, and not as one token on 1 week of my 16-week semester, but the core of everything you do. Have a diversity statement in your syllabus and talk about it, revise it. How's it going mid-semester? It's not just some sort of tack on page 12 that I'm not going to talk about. And to really bring it home in that way and make people know it actually means something to me, I think is really important.
Great. This has been a great evening. I've enjoyed it, and I want to, any final comments that any of you just must say? Okay. My final comments would just simply be in the form of thanks. I want to thank Professor Beck for facilitating. Ms. CPAC, again, for your coordinating. The camera, audiovisual people, you were essential. Thank you. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming. There will be additional sessions. I think there's one in January. Announcements are forthcoming, so watch for them. And finally, I'd just like for us to give the panelists again another round of applause.